What secret could be so dangerous that a man would not only be imprisoned for life, but erased from history itself? His face was hidden, voice was silenced, and his very memory was chiseled away from the stones of his cell? History, as we know it, is a story told by the victors. It is a grand narrative sculpted by the powerful. It is a chronicle of kings and queens, of empires won and lost, of great battles that shaped the borders and the destiny of our world. We read these accounts as fact, as a fixed record of what has been. But what happens when the most powerful man on earth decides someone should not exist in that story? What happens when the full and terrifying might of the state is focused, with surgical precision, on erasing a single human being from the pages of time? You do not get an empty page, you get a ghost. A phantom who walked the earth for decades, but whose life remains a deliberate, haunting void. A question mark carved into the heart of the past. For over 30 years, France's legendary Sun King, Louis XIV, held a man whose face no one was permitted to see, and whose name no one was allowed to speak. This is the story of a prisoner whose identity was considered so profoundly dangerous, so utterly toxic to the established order, that the state apparatus conspired to erase him from history, leaving behind only the ghost of a man of velvet mask and an eternal mystery. He was a man who received the finest care and the cruelest possible punishment. He was a human being whose secret was so great that it had to be buried with him under a false name in a forgotten grave. After his cell was scraped down to the bare stone, and everything he ever touched was systematically turned to ash. So, who was he? And what secret could have been so terrifying that it demanded not just his silence, not just his imprisonment, but his complete and total annihilation from human memory? The Sun King's shadow. The setup. To understand the prisoner, you must first understand his jailer, King Louis XIV. When he famously and perhaps apocryphally declared, "L'État, c'est moi," I am the state, it was not just a boastful flourish. It was, for all intents and purposes, a simple statement of fact. In the latter half of the 17th century, France was the undisputed supernova of Europe, and Louis was its blazing, incandescent core. He was the Sun King, and all of France, and indeed all of Europe, revolved around his person as if by gravitational law. His reign was the zenith of absolute power, an era where the monarch's personal will was the ultimate law of the land. He painstakingly cultivated an image of divine authority, presenting himself as a living God on earth, whose power flowed directly from heaven, unmediated by church or nobility. To maintain and project this image, Louis constructed the most magnificent and sophisticated cage the world had ever seen, the Palace of Versailles. What began as a modest hunting lodge was transformed into a breathtaking symbol of power, but it was more than just a home. It was a weapon of political control. The French nobility, once a proud, rebellious, and fiercely independent warrior class, were lured away from their regional power bases and reduced to courtiers. Their lives became a suffocating opera of etiquette, their ambitions and energies channeled into petty squabbles over who would be granted the honor of handing the king his shirt in the morning during the elaborate daily ritual known as the lever. This was a world built on secrets, a glittering facade of gold leaf and mirrored halls that hid a dark reality of constant intrigue, espionage, and paranoia. Louis's absolute power depended on absolute information. He had spies everywhere, listening in the gilded halls of Versailles, in the grimy taverns of Paris, and in the courts of foreign rivals. Nothing was too small for the king's attention, no whisper too faint. Control was not just important, it was everything. And for those who fell out of the king's favor, or who knew something they should not, there was a uniquely French instrument of terror, the lettre de cachet, a letter signed by the king himself that could imprison anyone for any reason, without a trial, without a lawyer, and without any hope of appeal. A person could simply be plucked from their life, from their family, their work, their world, and made to disappear into the labyrinthine prison system, their fate known only to the king and his most trusted ministers. It was a tool of absolute, arbitrary power. It was in this world of unchecked authority and state-sanctioned disappearance that our mystery begins. A world perfectly designed to create a man like the prisoner in the mask and to keep his secret buried for centuries. The king was the sun, but every sun, no matter how brilliant, casts a shadow. And in that shadow, a man was about to vanish from the face of the earth. The chief enforcer of the king's will, the man who would sign the fateful letter, was the Marquis de Louveau, the minister of war. Louveau was a man of terrifying efficiency, the perfect instrument for a king who demanded total and unquestioning obedience. He was the architect of Louis's formidable military might, but also the shadowy master of his secret prisons. And in the year 1669, a name landed on his desk that would become his most enduring and most disturbing legacy. A name that was perhaps not a name at all, but a simple label for a man who was about to become nothing. The letter and the arrest, the inciting incident. The story of our prisoner does not begin with a crime, a trial, or a public accusation. It begins with a quiet, unassuming letter sent from the desk of the Marquis de Louveau in the summer of 1669. The recipient was Benin d'Auvergne de Cinq-Mars, governor of the fortress prison of Pignerol. Pignerol was a remote, formidable citadel nestled in the Italian Alps, then under French control, a place reserved for enemies of the state and those who carried dangerous secrets. Cinq-Mars was a career jailer, a man whose entire professional life was dedicated to keeping the state's secrets locked securely away. He was about to receive the one secret that would define his career and echo throughout history. The letter informed Cinq-Mars of the impending arrival of a new prisoner, identified only as Eustache Dogger. Historians who have examined the original document noted that this name appears to be written in a different hand from the rest of the letter, a small but significant detail suggesting special attention from the highest levels. But it was the instructions that followed that were truly chilling and unprecedented. Louveau commanded Cinq-Mars to prepare a special cell with multiple, heavily secured doors, one closing upon the other, designed specifically to prevent anyone from even listening in. Dogger was to be given his basic needs: food, clothing, shelter, but under no circumstances was he to be allowed to speak to anyone, including Cinq-Mars himself, about anything other than those immediate daily needs. Then came the stark and brutal threat. If the prisoner ever speaks of anything else, Louveau wrote, he will be killed without hesitation. Let that sink in for a moment. This was not mere imprisonment. This was the deliberate, systematic unmaking of a person. To be forbidden from meaningful speech is to be cut off from the very essence of human connection, from the ability to share thoughts, to express identity, to be known. The order was absolute and terrifying: silence or death. Shortly thereafter, in late July of 1669, Eustache Dogger was arrested near Calais and began his long, silent journey to Pignerol. We can only imagine the terror and confusion of that moment. One day, a man with a life, a history, a family, a voice. The next, he is seized by agents of the state, his name replaced with a label, his voice effectively ripped from his throat, his entire world shrinking to the dark confines of a carriage bound for a prison he would never, ever leave. When he arrived at Pignerol in late August, St. Mars followed his orders with meticulous precision. The prisoner was immediately placed in his special, multi-layered cell, a prison within a prison. His only regular human contact was St. Mars himself, who brought him his daily food in silence. This prisoner, this man once known as Eustache Dogger, had officially ceased to exist. He had become a living secret, a ghost in the vast and powerful machine of the French state. And for the next 34 years, his life would be a silent tour of France's most infamous prisons, always under the watchful eye of the very same man, St. Mars. The jailer and his nameless prisoner were now bound together, their fates inexplicably intertwined until death. What could this man have possibly done? What could he possibly have known? A life in chains, the rising action. The 34 years that followed serve as a chilling testament to the total and suffocating power of the French state. The prisoner's life became a monotonous, soul-crushing cycle of silence and isolation, marked only by his periodic transfers from one fortress to another, his existence a secret that grew in weight and significance with every passing year. His first and longest home was the fortress of Pignerol. This was no common jail. It was a high-security prison for individuals who posed a direct threat to the state. Here, the prisoner lived in a strange and telling paradox. The official instructions were clear. He was only a valet, a man of low station who should be given only basic sustenance. And yet, the security measures surrounding him were greater than for any other inmate, including high-profile political prisoners. Pignerol held other, more famous captives, like the disgraced former superintendent of finances, Nicolas Fouquet, and the audacious noble, the Marquis de Lauzun. Fouquet lived in relative comfort, allowed visitors and correspondence. But the man called Dogger lived under a constant, crushing weight of secrecy. He was, according to the state, insignificant, yet he was treated as the most important secret in the entire prison. An odd and risky arrangement was eventually made. Fouquet's own valet often fell ill, and with the king's explicit permission, St. Mars assigned the silent prisoner Dogger to serve the fallen nobleman. It was a bizarre and dangerous situation. One man imprisoned for his boundless ambition, the other for a secret we can only guess at. The king's powerful minister Louveau was so concerned that he even wrote to Fouquet directly, asking if Dogger had ever spoken in front of others about his life before prison. It's a clear and anxious sign that the prisoner's past was the true source of the danger. The years crawled by in silence. Then, in 1681, St. Mars was promoted to governor of the Fort of Exiles, another remote prison. He took the prisoner with him. 6 years later, in 1687, another promotion, this time to the desolate and windswept island of Sainte Marguerite, just off the coast of Cannes. It was here, on this island prison that the legend of the mask truly began to take shape in the minds of the local population. With each move, the prisoner became less of a man and more of a phantom, an enigma known only to his jailer. Finally, in 1698, Saint Mars was given the most prestigious and feared post in the French prison system, governor of the infamous Bastille in Paris. And with him, as always, came his mysterious charge. He was transported in a covered sedan chair, his face completely obscured from the curious eyes of the world. For this prisoner, the Bastille was to be the final grim stop on a long journey through oblivion. Throughout much of this time, he wore the mask. But what was it, really? The legend, fueled by storytellers, speaks of an iron mask, a cruel and heavy device of torture. The image is powerful and barbaric, but the reality was likely something more subtle and perhaps even more sinister. Historical records, including the notes of a Bastille officer, suggest the mask was not made of iron, but of black velvet. It was a soft cloth mask, likely worn only when he was being moved, or when a doctor or other outsider was present. Any time another human being might catch a glimpse of his face. And is the velvet not even more disturbing than the iron? An iron mask is a straightforward instrument of torture, but a velvet mask is an instrument of pure erasure. It was not designed to inflict physical pain, but to methodically blot out a man's identity, to deny him the most basic of human connections, the simple act of being seen. The face is the canvas of the soul, the locus of our identity. To take a man's face is to systematically dismantle his personhood. Philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre believe that our sense of self is not built in isolation, but emerges through what he called the gaze of the other. We exist in part because others recognize us. Strip away the possibility of being seen, and you do not simply hide a person, you unravel the very framework of their identity. Psychologists echo this. Social acknowledgement is not a luxury. It is a fundamental human need. Without it, the mind begins to fracture, reality itself becomes unstable, and a living man can turn into a ghost long before death. For 34 years, this man was denied a face, a voice, and a name. He was a walking void, a human being reduced to a specter. The question that has echoed through the centuries is simply and urgently, why? The whispers of France, the rising action. While the prisoner languished in enforced silence, the outside world, which could not see him, whispered. The sheer strangeness of his confinement, the unprecedented level of secrecy, created a vacuum that human nature instinctively filled with rumor, speculation, and elaborate theory. Over the centuries, these whispers coalesced into several major narratives, each attempting to solve the puzzle of his identity. The first category of theory is perhaps the most straightforward. He was a nobleman or a high-ranking diplomat who committed a grave act of treason against the king. One leading candidate for a time was an Italian diplomat named Count Ercole Antonio Mattioli. Mattioli had indeed betrayed a secret deal to sell a strategic fortress to France, and an enraged Louis XIV had him abducted and imprisoned. For a while, this seemed a compelling fit. The name under which the masked man was eventually buried, Marcaili, sounded suspiciously similar. However, historical records ultimately spoil this tidy story. Documents clearly show that Mattioli died in 1694, almost a full decade before our prisoner passed away in the Bastille. So the count is out. This leads us to the second, and by far the most famous and romantic, theory, the one that transformed a historical mystery into an immortal legend. What if the prisoner was not an enemy of the king, but was in fact dangerously connected to him by blood? This revolutionary idea was first advanced in a significant way by the philosopher and writer Voltaire. Having been a prisoner in the Bastille himself, Voltaire had heard the prison gossip from guards and staff who had served the masked man. He reasoned that such extreme, lifelong secrecy could only mean one thing: the prisoner's face was instantly recognizable, and the sight of it would be profoundly dangerous to the monarchy. Voltaire concluded he must have been the king's older, illegitimate brother. This explosive theory was later taken up and immortalized by the novelist Alexandre Dumas. Dumas, a master storyteller, was not one to let history stand in the way of a good story, and he added a brilliant, dramatic twist. The prisoner was not just a brother. He was the king's identical twin, hidden away at birth to prevent a civil war over the rightful succession to the throne. It is a fantastic, swashbuckling story, the basis for movies and novels, but it is almost certainly not history. There is no credible evidence whatsoever that Louis XIV had a twin. Royal births were highly public affairs, witnessed by dozens of courtiers to prevent exactly this kind of uncertainty. And the idea of smuggling a second royal baby out of the Queen's birthing chamber is simply unbelievable. So if he was not a disgraced diplomat, and he was not the king's secret twin, who was he? This brings us to our third category of theory, which most modern historians now believe is closest to the truth. It is a theory that is at once more mundane, and in its own way, far more chilling. What if the prisoner was exactly what the original arrest letter said he was? Only a valet? This is the conclusion of dedicated historians like Paul Sonnino, who has spent decades immersed in the state archives of the period. The key to the mystery, this theory argues, is not who the prisoner was, but what he knew. A valet in a powerful household is, in many ways, invisible. He sees everything. He hears everything. So what catastrophic secret did this particular valet stumble upon? One possibility connects him to one of the darkest and most sordid scandals of the entire reign, the affair of the poisons. Between 1677 and 1682, Parisian high society was rocked by a massive investigation into witchcraft, black magic, and murder for hire, with accusations reaching all the way to the king's own mistress, Madame de Montespan. One nobleman implicated was a man named Eustache Dogger de Cavoye. The name is a tantalizing, near-perfect match. But again, the historical records do not align. That Dogger de Cavoye was held in a different prison and died long before the man in the mask. The most compelling version of the valet theory, proposed by Sonnino, suggests that our Eustache Dogger was the servant to Cardinal Mazarin, the immensely powerful chief minister of France during Louis XIV's youth. Mazarin had amassed an enormous and deeply illegal fortune through nefarious means. Sonnino proposes that Mazarin had stolen a vast sum of money and jewels from the previous English royal family, who had been in exile. Years later, as Louis XIV was attempting to forge a crucial and secret alliance with the restored English crown. His valet, Eustache Dogger, must have blabbed at the wrong time. He knew of a financial crime so large and so sensitive that its revelation could derail international diplomacy, deeply embarrass the French crown, and undermine the king's own legitimacy. This theory neatly explains all the paradoxes. The prisoner was treated as a man of low station because he was one, but the secret he carried was of the absolute highest importance. He could not simply be executed because a sudden death might draw suspicion and questions. He had to be kept alive, but completely and utterly silenced, his identity erased to protect the far more important secret he held inside his head. The elaborate security was never to protect the prisoner. It was to protect the king from the prisoner. We have explored the long, silent life of this phantom prisoner and the competing theories about his identity, from a king's brother to a humble valet who knew too much. Before we reach the final dramatic act of this story, we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments below which theory you find most convincing and why. The death of a ghost, the climax. The end, when it finally came, was as quiet and anonymous as the life the prisoner was forced to live. In the autumn of 1703, after 34 years of confinement, after being moved from the Alps to a desolate island to the heart of Paris, the prisoner fell ill in his cell in the Bastille. He died on the 19th of November. Even in death, the state's obsession with his complete and total erasure did not cease. In fact, it intensified into a final, frantic act. His burial was rushed, taking place the very next day in the local parish cemetery of Saint Paul de Champs. In the parish records, he was given a final false name, Marcaille. The age listed, about 45, was also likely a deliberate falsehood, as the real man arrested in 1669 would have been significantly older. It was one last lie to muddy the waters of history. But what happened next reveals the true depth of the state's fear, a paranoia that bordered on the fanatical. Immediately after the burial, officials descended upon his cell in the Bastille. It was not enough that the man was dead. Every last physical trace of his 34-year existence had to be systematically obliterated. The meager wooden furniture was smashed to pieces and burned. His old clothes were gathered up and incinerated. Any metal items, cups, plates, buckles, were melted down into unrecognizable lumps. Finally, in a last, desperate act of purification, the very walls of his cell were scraped, scoured, and then whitewashed, as if to bleach his memory from the very stones themselves. It was a meticulous, almost ritualistic attempt to create a perfect void, to make it as if this man had never drawn a single breath. But in their frantic efforts to erase him, they accomplished the exact opposite. They created an immortal legend. The empty space they so violently carved out of history became a profound and enduring question mark that has captivated the world for over 300 years. By trying with all their might to make him nothing, they inadvertently ensured he would become an enigma for the ages. The ghost they tried so desperately to exorcise would now haunt the imagination of the world forever. The legacy of a faceless man. The story of the man in the iron mask endures not simply because it is a fascinating unsolved mystery. It resonates so deeply across the centuries because it forces us to confront timeless, and fundamental questions about identity, about power, and about what it truly means to be a human being. His legend is a dark mirror held up to the face of absolute authority, reflecting the terrifying power of a state to not only imprison a body, but to attempt the annihilation of a soul. The mask, whether it was made of velvet or of iron, is the central and most powerful symbol. It represents the ultimate act of dehumanization. Our faces are how we meet the world. They are the nexus of our identity, our emotions, our very recognition as a unique individual. To be denied a face is to be denied the recognition, to be rendered an object, a thing. The prisoner was condemned to live as a non-person in the eyes of others, a constant walking reminder of his own erasure. He was a man, but he was not allowed to be a person. His 34 years of enforced silence highlight another profound truth. We are social creatures, defined and created by our interactions with others. Our sense of self is not forged in a vacuum. It is built and maintained in the constant call and response of human connection. What happens to a mind locked away in solitude for decades, with no one to truly talk to and no one to truly see you? It is a kind of living death, a psychological destruction that is perhaps even crueler than any swift execution. Ultimately, the story of this prisoner is a chilling reminder of how fragile the human self truly is. It demonstrates how our identity, something we think of as innate and personal, is in fact deeply dependent on the external markers we take for granted. Our name, our history, our relationships, our face in the mirror. The French monarchy, in order to protect a state secret, methodically stripped a man of all these things. They took his name, they hid his face, they silenced his voice, and they burned every object he ever touched. They tried, with all the power at their disposal, to reduce him to zero. But they failed, because a story remains, a mystery remains. The very act of trying to make someone nothing has ironically made him immortal. He is the ultimate symbol of the voiceless, the forgotten, the erased. He is a haunting testament to the fact that even the most absolute power cannot fully extinguish the spark of a human life. It can only create a ghost, a mystery that challenges us, even centuries later, to look into the darkness and ask, "Who were you?" In the end, the prisoner's fate forces us to confront a haunting question. If your name, your face, and your entire history were stripped away, if every trace of your existence was scraped from the walls of time, what part of you would remain? Would you still be you without the recognition of others? Without the gaze that affirms your identity? This story is more than a mystery. It is a mirror reflecting the fragile threads that tie us to the world. Existentialist thinkers such as Camus and Heidegger remind us that existence is defined not just by living, but by meaning. Remove a person's history, erase their name, deny their reflection in the eyes of others, and you cast them into what Camus called the absurd, a life stripped of coherence and purpose. What happened to the man in the iron mask was not just imprisonment. It was an existential annihilation, a descent into a void where even the concept of self could not survive. A name, a face, a voice. When you lose them, you do not just lose freedom, you lose the very fabric of self. That is what makes this story so unsettling. It is not only about who he was, but about what any of us would become if we were turned into a living shadow. So what do you believe his ultimate secret was? Was he a fallen noble? A political pawn? A silent witness to a truth too explosive for the world to know? Share your theory in the comments below. And if you enjoy unraveling the darkest corners of history, exploring the depths of philosophy, and uncovering the hidden truths of psychology, make sure to subscribe to Thought 101 and join us for more journeys into the mysteries that refuse to die.